Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I am Stephanie Bree, and today I'm talking about the classic uh, square role-playing game Final Fantasy VII. And if you know by the title of this video, I'm asking the question, is Final Fantasy VII the most important game in history? I'm pretty sure this is going to be a controversial subject no matter who you are. Nintendo fans will be screaming at this video, Super Mario Brothers! Xbots are going to be chiming in something something Halo, something something Fable. But we're going to talk about Final Fantasy VII. Here we are. Final Fantasy VII. Let's set the stage. In the late 80s, Dungeons and Dragons was very influential on video games, and gamers were starting to get bored with the typical, beat 'em up action platformers that we were used to, the arcade games that we were used to, and we wanted something with a little more depth. But the technology at the time limited the options, so role playing games were fairly limited and fairly stale. Both sides of the pond. The Japanese role playing games were pretty straightforward rip-offs of the Western and American and European role playing games, and that they were all getting their influences from Dungeons and Dragons. They were trying to recreate D&D on a computer. Things like Ultima, the original Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest / Dragon Warrior, Wizardry, etc. So they did exist, and they were somewhat popular among a certain circle of gamers, but they weren't mainstream by any stretch of the imagination. The Super Nintendo introduced a little bit more story-driven RPGs, but they were still, a lot of text and very few cutscenes. Mostly it was single graphics with text. You had some stuff on the Sega CD and the TurboGrafx CD that had some cinematics, but they were very little animation, and again, it was a lot of just a frame of animation and then a lot of text. Some voiceover, but not much. In 1994, Sony released in Japan a machine called the PlayStation, and it came to America in September 1995. Right alongside it, Sega introduced their own CD-based 32-bit game console, the Sega Saturn. Now, the Saturn had a rough launch in the US, not so much in Japan, but in the US it had a very rough launch, and it suffered. It struggled to get a footing. But if you go back and look at month-to-month sales worldwide, mostly because of the strength in Japan, but also, it did eventually pick up a little bit in the US. The Saturn was outselling the PlayStation month over month. For a little bit. Barely. Just barely, but it was outselling it. And then Final Fantasy VII released. And then PlayStation shot ahead. And not only did it shoot ahead, it shot ahead so far ahead that there was no coming back, and Saturn was eventually discontinued a year later. Sega couldn't afford it anymore. And then they had to scrap it to realign and prepare for the launch of the Dreamcast. Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII were still propelling sales of the PlayStation even after the Dreamcast came out. The system was still selling because of these games. What Final Fantasy VII did was it solidified cinematics in video games. There were other games before it and around the same time that introduced story elements to them, but none of them had the sales impact or the impact on gamers that Final Fantasy VII had. I would argue, rightfully, I believe, that Final Fantasy VII changed gaming forever. Absolutely. It introduced us to what we classify today as modern gaming. Modern gaming being story-driven games with a more realistic aesthetic. Now, Final Fantasy VII is not as polished as modern games are. It was primitive by today's standards, but at the time it was mind-blowing. So much so that it convinced me, a huge Sega and Nintendo nerd, who had owned every Sega console up to this point and every Nintendo console up to this point, to buy a PlayStation for this game. That's how huge this game was. I've already talked about how much I do not like JRPGs. I do like some Western RPGs, but I'm more into the Dungeons and Dragons type stuff. So I want games that play like or feel like D&D. Stuff like Diablo, Fable, Elder Scrolls, World of Warcraft, stuff like that. Stuff that makes me feel like I'm playing a game of D&D. Final Fantasy does not do that. Final Fantasy is like playing a live-action anime. And Final Fantasy VII is no different. It's steampunk. No, not steampunk. Cyberpunk. Excuse me, I get those two mixed up. But Final Fantasy VII had a huge impact on gaming and gaming culture. It wasn't the first story-based game, but it was one of the biggest ones at the time, and it was the one that introduced gamers outside of the handful of RPG enthusiasts to the concept of story-based gaming. Final Fantasy VII introduced and made RPGs, and specifically JRPGs, mainstream. So if this game hadn't been a success, we might not have got World of Warcraft or Fable. Or they wouldn't have been as popular as they ended up being. And I can say this with confidence, because if you look at the sales of Final Fantasy games and other JRPGs up to this point, they were not strong sales. Nintendo fans, let's talk about Super NES. Nintendo fans love to retroactively retcon the Super NES as this great, fantastic system for JRPGs. And while it is true, it had a ton of them. You ever noticed how rare they are and expensive they are? You know, you do notice that, right? They are rare and expensive. And the reason they're rare and expensive in the aftermarket is because they did not sell well. They were not popular in their day. They're popular now, and they're popular now because of Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy III was the most popular JRPG we had at the time, and even it didn't break sales records. It didn't move the needle much. Chrono Trigger, for all the love it gets, and Secret of Evermore, and ActRaiser, and all these other games that people love to spout as reasons why the Super Nintendo was a success, are not reasons why the Super Nintendo was a success, because they didn't sell in their day. Its contemporary competition from Sega, Panzer Dragoon Saga, was a dud, and goes for above $500 a copy today because nobody fucking bought it. Nintendo themselves have largely gone without JRPGs on their consoles because even they know they weren't a thing. They have attempted a few, mostly Paper Mario and Mario and Luigi on their handheld systems, and notably the one they did with Square in 1996, just a year before this game came out, Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars, which again is rare and expensive because it didn't sell well. It sold well compared to other JRPGs, but not well enough for a Nintendo game, and definitely not, in the stratosphere. Earthbound is another example of a JRPG that is extremely rare and expensive because of that. So let's not retcon history. Let's just say Super Nintendo had a bunch of JRPGs, but they were only popular after this game came out and made the genre mainstream. So let's set the record straight. You, gamer watching this, may have bought JRPGs on your Super Nintendo, but your friends didn't. I didn't. I was playing Mega Man, Castlevania, Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, yes, Mario, Killer Instinct, Kirby, Donkey Kong Country. I was not playing JRPGs on the Super Nintendo. I didn't own a single one back in its heyday. Not a single one back in its heyday. All my friends who had Super Nintendos, none of them had JRPGs. Not one. Even the ones who were D&D gamers like myself did not have JRPGs on the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis. Even though they did exist, nobody had them. I rented Phantasy Star 4 on the Sega Genesis, and I rented Final Fantasy 3 on the Super Nintendo. They were fun, but not fun enough to buy. Not for me, anyways. Final Fantasy changed that. Final Fantasy VII is one of those rare games that not only have I beat it, I've 100%ed it and beat it multiple times. 100%ed it multiple times. This is a game I absolutely love. And Final Fantasy VII was not isolated to the Sony PlayStation. It was also available on Windows at the time. And it was a big hit on Windows as well. And I had it on Windows. Yes, I bought it for the PC. And I had it on the PlayStation. And I bought it again on the PS3. And I bought the HD remake on the PS4. So yes, I love this game. Didn't care for the remake, but that's another video for another day. So Final Fantasy VII, excuse me, absolutely changed gaming forever. It solidified the JRPG as a staple in the gaming world and has launched the genre into the stratosphere as a result of its immediate success and continued ongoing success. Even the franchise itself owes its survival to Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is also notable for being a huge game. It spanned 3 discs, largely because of the number of cinematics it had, but also it was a big game. It took up a lot of space on your computer or on your hard drive. It took up a lot of space on those discs. It was a long game. It was an epic game. It was the start of what we classify today as epic games. The 40-plus hour continuous game that you play for months to a year or more. You put a lot of hours into this game. Up to this point, prior to this game coming out, and a handful of others, games were short. You could beat most games in 15 hours or less. You could rent a game and beat it in a weekend. You could not do that with Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is also notable because up to this point, Squaresoft, prior to their merger with Enix, becoming today Square Enix, now owned by a bigger company we don't talk about, Squaresoft did have a pretty strong, solid partnership with Nintendo. In fact, this game started out development as a Nintendo Ultra 64 title. And then Square canceled that game and then migrated it over to the PlayStation. And the reason they did that was because of Nintendo's big fuck up, middle finger to Nintendo, keeping the N64 cartridge based when everyone else in the industry was going to CD-ROM. And Square wanted this game on CD-ROM because they knew they couldn't tell the story they wanted to tell on a single cartridge. It didn't have the capacity for this game. It couldn't fit on a single cartridge. Even the biggest cartridge they offered, which was 96 meg, wasn't big enough for this game. So this was what we would say the beginning of the downfall of Nintendo. Nintendo went through some dark years after this game came out. The N64 struggled, the GameCube struggled. The Wii is more or less an anomaly, but we won't talk about it. And then the Wii U struggled. It took all the way till the Switch coming out before Nintendo got back on their feet, so to speak. Yeah, their handhelds are another different story, but Square was still making games for their handhelds, so there is that. Their handhelds were successful despite the fact that they didn't have much success in the console business. Final Fantasy VII is also notable for having an emotional impact on gamers because of what happens in the story, and I'm not going to spoil it just in case you haven't played this game yet. I am just going to say that it brought a lot of gamers, myself included, to tears midway through and had an impact on us emotionally speaking. And has scarred many of us, in fact. Final Fantasy VII also spawned its own franchise. So there are spin-offs in the Final Fantasy VII mythos and mythology. Games that take place in that setting. Other video games that take place in that setting. And they're all various degrees of successful, mostly on PlayStation consoles and handhelds, PSP, PS3, etc. So Final Fantasy VII can be credited with Sony's massive success in PlayStation. It can be credited with the success of story-driven games, and it can be credited with the success of JRPGs as a whole. For those three reasons alone, I say this is one of the most important games in history. If PlayStation hadn't been a success to the point that shoved Sega entirely out of the market completely, there wouldn't have been room for an Xbox. There wouldn't have been an Xbox. If Final Fantasy VII hadn't been the success that it was, we wouldn't have got World of Warcraft when we did. It would have taken longer, and it probably wouldn't have had the impact because there wouldn't have been a market for it. We wouldn't have got Skyrim. Look at the sales numbers of the Elder Scrolls games that came out before Final Fantasy VII, and then look at the sales numbers of the Elder Scrolls games that came out after Final Fantasy VII, and you will see Final Fantasy VII brought in a lot of gamers, took a lot of gamers who had no interest in role-playing games and introduced them to role-playing games. And yes, Final Fantasy VII changed RPGs forever too. It made the genre more accessible to the masses and had more mass appeal. Prior to that, JRPGs were niche, and they were niche for a reason. And they became mainstream because of this game. Even though sequels have had various degrees of success of their own right, Final Fantasy VII is the one that put it on the map. There is a high probability, very high probability, you owned Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation at some point in time, or played it on an emulator, or played it on PS3, or played it on PC. There's a high probability of that. Chances are very good you've played this game. I will maintain that Final Fantasy VII is the most important game in history because modern gaming is built on this game. There were other games at the time that helped establish the foundation, but this is the game that brought gaming as a whole into the mainstream. Not just JRPGs, not just PlayStation, not just Japanese games, not just story-driven games, but gaming as a whole became mainstream after this game. Prior to that, it was nerds who played video games, and sports fanatics would play Madden, and a few other people would play games along the way. But for the most part, this game made gaming mainstream. And today, gaming as a whole makes more money than Hollywood. And that's because of this game. This game introduced us to that concept. And every game that came out in the media aftermath of this game was trying to top this game, including its immediate sequel, Final Fantasy VIII, which spanned 4 discs. The reason Final Fantasy VIII had to span 4 discs is because they had to put more effort into the graphics. If you know anything about the way 3D graphics work, is you only have so many character models to go around. You have a set number of polygons. So to make that game bigger, what they did was they spaced it out more so they could put more polygons into the characters so that they could have a little bit less story, so they could stretch it out and spread it out so they could have better looking graphics in this game, so they could have more impressive cinematics. Legend of Dragoon did this as well, also on PlayStation, which was another highly impressive game for the time, don't get me wrong, but was a response to this game. Even Nintendo themselves recognized that they needed RPGs on the console, and they launched Paper Mario on the 64. And then they launched Mario and Luigi on the GBA, and then they've continued producing games in either franchise since. And they even increased the RPG elements in The Legend of Zelda as a response to this game, to make it more like a JRPG, to make it have that mass appeal. So yeah, this is the single most important game in the history of gaming. There are games that came before it that are notable for their impact on gaming, like Super Mario Brothers and Pac-Man, for example. But this is the one that made gaming mainstream. Pac-Man made gaming popular for the time, and Super Mario Brothers made Nintendo a household name, for sure. But Final Fantasy VII is the game that took gaming from the niche gamer subculture into the masses, and now everybody's a gamer. Back in the 90s, if you were a gamer, you were a gamer. Now, everyone's a gamer. There is no such thing as a gamer anymore because everybody games. Thank you for watching.